Welcome to Vendetta Sports Media. This is Eight-Sided Freaks, and the glory of UFC 300 is behind us. We are back to the UFC Apex days. And this week's UFC Apex card is no good. It is quite bad. I think there could be some fun fights, but nothing fun in terms of like, oh, two future title contenders. More fun in the terms of, oh, these guys are both really bad or both bad in the same areas or are both like two exciting fighters that might get a quick finish, but if they don't, it's going to be a bad fight. So could be some entertainment, but it's more meme entertainment than high-level mixed martial arts. So we're going to stay away from that card, and we're going to focus on some fight announcements because we do have a decent amount of news. Last week we didn't have time to touch on the fight announcements because we were recapping UFC 300. So we're going to go back and hit on some of that old news that is fairly important. So that includes UFC 302 and UFC 303. We have the main and co-main for 302, and then 303 we have the main and I assume what's going to be the co-main, but I think that card is it's a little bit further away from being official, and some more fighters are campaigning to get on that card since that is the Conor McGregor card. So we're going to give our thoughts on those two cards, and then we will talk about UFC 304, which announced today was in Manchester. So a little bit of a long intro, but we have a decent amount of news to discuss. Jerry, how you feeling about this selection of news we've got and this upcoming fight card?
It might not be the most breaking news outside of the Manchester and UFC 304, but it's all stuff that needs to be touched on. And we didn't have time in the last 2 weeks. Typically, our show is an hour long. Last two episodes have both been an hour and a half because UFC 300 had that much. We touched on every single fight one way or another, even if it was just briefly for both our preview of it and our recap. So if you haven't watched those, definitely go check out that recap one especially, because we had a whole week off UFC fights. So still kind of basking in that glory of what UFC 300 was. And the news that came, it's good stuff and has us looking forward to the next couple pay-per-views.
Yep. And I like the way you put that. It's stuff that needs to be talked about. And if we would have talked about this last week when it dropped after 300, we would have had a 2.5-hour episode. Yeah. So much better doing it this week when we don't have anything to talk about. And let's get started right at we'll go in chronological order of when the fights are going to happen. So Conor versus Chandler is probably the biggest news, but you guys can wait until about the half-hour mark. Let's talk about the fights that are happening first, and that starts with Islam Makhachev and Dustin Poirier. That is going down at UFC 302 in New Jersey on June 1st. So this fight they were aiming for a lot of different challengers for this fight card. Coming out of UFC 300, you had two fights that, hey, maybe the winner could challenge for the title. Ends up being Max Holloway beating Justin Gaethje, and that takes Gaethje's name out of contention, and it's a little bit harder to give Max that shot because he's got so many options. You don't know what the future is for him, so it's harder to give him the shot. Arman Tsarukyan beats Charles Oliveira and says no to the shot. It's a very, very quick turnaround. Probably would have had 6 weeks at most for training, probably less. So Dustin Poirier is the name they fell on. What's your opinion on Dustin Poirier getting the shot?
I mean, was it last time he fought? No, he won one. Yeah, because he knocked out Benoit Saint Denis, and that's a nice win, but that's over the 11th ranked guy in the division, if not the 12th ranked guy at the time. Fight prior to that, he was put unconscious by Justin Gaethje, who, in my opinion, Gaethje should have had the title shot. Obviously, pieces fell in different ways, and it wasn't able to happen, but I think he was the most deserving coming into 2024. Now it seems like he lost, Oliveira lost, Arman, rightfully so. I think I would have been real upset if Arman had taken this fight on the not short notice, but with only this much time to get prepared, because you have to be prepared for a guy like Islam Makhachev, and I don't think this was a good enough amount of time. Much rather see these two, say Makhachev does win, give me Arman and Islam later on in this year, maybe October, November time. So It just leaves Dustin Poirier because there's no one else you can really have out there. And I know there was talks of maybe doing Islam versus Leon Edwards at 300 was offered. Islam said no to that because of Ramadan. So this has worked out, and it's the only guy who's really there and somewhat deserving of a title fight. So I have no issue with it, but I think there were better options a couple months ago.
Yeah, and it would have been a 6-week turnaround for Arman Tsarukyan. Yeah. And he went 3 rounds, so it's not like he went out there and got a one-punch knockout. And 6 weeks is just recovery, say 2 weeks recovery, and then a 4-week training camp, and then a weight cut. It's like that is just a really, really tough ask. And to do that against, Islam Makhachev, you need to be at your top of your game to beat Islam. If he was facing someone else who was a easier fight, then maybe we're having a different discussion. But you only get so many chances at the world title, and to go out there unprepared, not ideal. And that being said, I think it's really hard to give Dustin Poirier this title shot at UFC 302 just because we've seen him in title fights and we've seen him lose. And then we saw him lose a number 1 contender fight to Justin Gaethje. So he lost to Charles, he lost to Gaethje, and both those guys, they lost this weekend, which on one hand, it's better for him because the guys that beat him are no longer in the discussion. At the same time, it's also 2 guys that have wins over guys who couldn't beat. So it just kind of depends how you look at it. And neither way really favors Dustin. So I don't like it from that perspective. And I don't really think Dustin stands much of a chance in this fight. Islam fairly defensively responsible on the feet. Unless Dustin lands, I'll give him, he can land that one shot that ends the fight, but I think that happens a very, very small percentage of the time. So I don't even think it's a good matchup for Dustin.
And prior to that Justin Gaethje head kick knockout, the only 2 fights he had lost pretty recently were Charles Oliveira. Oliveira took him to the ground, took his back and submitted him. And then Khabib Nurmagomedov, exact same thing. Took him down, took his back and submitted him. Islam is just as good a grappler as both of these guys. Unless Dustin Poirier is really improved in the grappling department, which didn't look like he was all that confident going on the ground with Benoit Saint Denis, he's in trouble. And this might be a very, very quick fight. Unless, like you said, he can catch him on the feet, which it's possible. This is why we love this sport partially, is because you can just suddenly out of nowhere clap someone and it's done. But I don't see it happening because Islam, like you mentioned, is so good defensively on the feet. He has good striking offensively as well. So it's just all around a bad matchup for Poirier.
Yeah, and I honestly think Poirier's grappling is kind of regressing, if anything. Just like I know he beat Benoit Saint Denis, but he was getting worked very badly in the grappling. Like he got up a couple times, so credit to him. He had one deep gilly, didn't land it, but he had several gilly attempts that were no shot to even come close to happening. The first one was the closest. So I just feel like Islam's going to go out there, attempt some takedowns. Dustin's going to jump gilly. Maybe one's kind of tight that he doesn't land, but then it's just Islam working him from top position. I think Dustin's grappling is progressively getting worse as he's getting older. It's hard to, you're grappling. You obviously want time to develop it, but it gets to a point of diminishing returns where you're no longer as athletic. Makes it harder to go out there and defend takedowns. I believe he has a hip surgery as well under his belt. I'd have to fact check that, but I know he had a significant injury a while back. And it's just things that don't help you become a better grappler. So I do have a tough time seeing Dustin win this fight. I do want to throw out one name because we've talked about a lot of guys who were not able to make the walk because they lost their last fight or for time reasons and all this. What would you make if they gave this shot to Mateusz Gamrot?
There were 2 names that I was looking at outside of everything, and it was Gamrot, possibly Fiziev, but also Moicano, which we're seeing some crazy title fights get thrown out there at the moment. Alexander Pantoja is fighting the 10th ranked Steve Erikseig, so that's not exactly one that's up there. We saw Sean Strickland get the title shot when he was far down the rankings. It wouldn't have surprised me if a guy like Gamrot got the title fight, but he at the same time, I don't. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head what he's done recently, but I don't think it's been that impressive. I think he's been struggling a bit more as of late than he had been. So I wouldn't have minded it had he gotten it, but it's kind of the same boat as Poirier of who would get it. And I think Gamrot might give us a more exciting fight and a more balanced fight, which is my only thing, but wasn't the way, wasn't to be.
Yeah, the Gamrot resume is RDA decision at 298, I believe that was. Then he got the win over Fiziev, where Fiziev hurt his leg. Got the split decision over Turner. Then it's the loss to Beneil Dariush, and then you have to go back a couple of years, but he was riding a win streak before that. So the one thing that I think Gamrot had in his favor was that he went to Abu Dhabi, weighed in as a backup, and then they still didn't give him the fight when Charles pulled out. And I think he's a better grappler than Poirier, and probably would have had a better chance in that realm. I'm not sure that he would have went out there and been able to strike with Islam. I think Islam was probably a better striker, but I think that would have at least given us some better grappling exchanges. And he kind of got screwed when he was there in Abu Dhabi as a backup, and then when the backup was needed, they called Volkanovski. So kind of feel bad for him in that regard. So I wouldn't have hated seeing him, kind of get right in a way.
Yeah, and I kind of forgot about that he was the backup, and they just said, nah, you've done all the work to cut the weight. You've done all the work preparing for a fight. We're going to give it to a guy who's been sitting on his couch drinking beer for the last 2 months instead.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be fair to give it to him as well, but
yeah, in hindsight, that was the wrong way to approach that.
Yeah. Who would have thought that? Guy coming off nothing was a guy compared to ready to fight.
And they had a very, very close fight the first time, and the guy who was training won the fight, and the guy who was training who won the fight was also the younger fighter.
Yep.
Very tough stuff there.
Stuff adds up.
All right, the co-main event, we have Sean Strickland versus Paulo Costa. Were you surprised by this fight announcement? Because I was surprised.
I was a little surprised, only because I kind of thought we would see Hamzat fighting a guy like Paulo Costa. It's kind of at least what I hoped. Does Hamzat have a fight announced?
Yeah, he's got the Whitaker fight.
That's right. Okay, so
when they announced the Whitaker fight, when we talked about that on the podcast, we were all pretty much like, well, I'm kind of surprised they didn't do Sean versus Whitaker.
Yep. And I guess that's still where I'm at. Is I thought those would have made sense. And then obviously I wanted to see Paulo Costa and Hamzat fight.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know why.
I think you can flip these. I think they got the right four, but I think they got them in the wrong order.
Exactly, because I don't know if this fight still intrigues me, and it should be fun. Mm-hmm. I'm always more excited for this one than the main event, just because I think the main event is going to be so one-sided. A lot of things can be proven wrong. You don't know, but it's surprising, but at the same time, like, everyone else seems kind of booked up for the most part, so why not do something like Sean Strickland and Paulo Costa? And hey, you never know, Paulo Costa might come in and get a win. Then you can immediately throw him up for in the title conversation. Sean Strickland comes in and defeats one of the tougher guys in the division. It's also a Paulo Costa fight, so you never know if it's going to happen until they're stepping into the cage. So a lot of ifs, ands, and buts, but I'm excited for it.
Yeah, and how do I word this? If you put me in a time machine and ask me if this fight makes sense before Sean's a champion, I say yes.
Yeah.
Like, it makes much more sense. But now where Sean is, he beats Izzy, then he loses to Driscus, and then Paulo loses to Whitaker, and then he gets a step up to fight the guy that was just a champion after a loss. It's just kind of weird how all these pieces came together. But it kind of depends on how you view Sean Strickland, because I don't think Sean Strickland is that good for being a former champion. I still think he's probably a 5 to 7 guy in the rankings who's just kind of there. Well, that's kind of what this fight is. 2 guys in that 5 to 7 range, maybe 4 to 8. You expanded a little bit, but 2 guys in a similar range of the rankings if you take out the fact that Sean is a former champion. So I don't hate it from that regard at all. I just think it's interesting how Paulo lost to Whitaker and then ends up fighting the guy who just lost the championship fight. It is kind of weird how that aspect of it came together.
And it wasn't even like he just lost the Whitaker fight. He was 13-0 in his career. Three of his last 4 fights, lost to Izzy, lost to Vettori, and a loss to Whitaker. His only win in that time was beating Luke Rockhold, who we saw fight in Karate Combat recently. So
he won. He won in Karate Combat.
That dude out of there. There was some nice knockouts on the Karate Combat recently, but that's what I'm saying. Like, he's not fighting guys who are still around, and I think it would have made more sense for him to fight a guy in the middle of that rankings. If not like a Hamzat now, maybe an Iordimov or just Cannonier have a fight. Maybe make those two guys go at it. Or I know he just fought Vettori recently, but why not a Vettori rematch? Because that one was close to, from what I can remember. There were other fights that made more sense, and I still think we should have gotten the Strickland and Whitaker fight, and that would have changed everything.
Yeah, and I do kind of feel bad for Cannonier because Cannonier, in my opinion, very good fighter who kind of gets overlooked because of the way he lost to Izzy. And he's coming off a win over, he beat the shit out of Marvin Vettori in his last fight.
Yes,
beat the shit out of Marvin. And then before that, I believe was the close fight with Sean Strickland, where he won that fight, but now everyone likes Sean because Sean says interesting things on the mic and he was a champion. So now everyone pretends that Sean won that fight when he really lost. That's
another fight. That's another fight I would have loved to see Cannonier and Sean Strickland run it back.
Mm-hmm. And at this point, Cannonier is 40 because he hasn't fought in a significant period of time. So it's just like, and I know he had a knee injury because he was supposed to fight Hamzat on that instead of Usman. That was originally supposed to be Cannonier. Then Cannonier tears his MCL. And that fight gets shuffled again. But it just kind of feels like Cannonier is getting left out. I don't know if it's because he's injured or I don't know what the deal is. But he has just been kind of left out of this middleweight circulation of fights. And now he's 40. And now, to fight one of these guys, they're all booked. So your next fight's probably not going to be to the end of the year if you get one of the big name guys, unless you're fighting like an Imavov. It's just so weird for Cannonier, and I kind of feel bad for him because, like I said, he is 40. It's not like he's a 32-year-old getting passed over. He's a 40-year-old who's kind of getting passed over and not getting the fight he needs to move up. When, I mean, you put him in there with DDP, and I may just pick Cannonier. Yeah. So,
agree.
Just another thought there because I think that aspect of this fight booking is kind of going under the radar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's also, it's just one of those things because Cannonier was a dangerous dude. Sure, he is 40 now, but he can still beat the hell out of people at the 171 mark. It's unfortunate for him because he deserved to be treated a little better. And it seems like they're like, oh, no one liked your last fight. We're going to just throw you to the side and let everybody run around you because he's the only one, I think, in that top half of the rankings that doesn't have a fight booked.
Yeah, because they booked. We've talked about 4 of these guys that are booked in between Chimaev, Whitaker, Strickland, Costa. Then you book Izzy and DDP. That's 6 guys booked. And then
spots.
Yeah, it's tough for him. So
yeah. And I'm gonna just throw this out there. If he wants to fight, because this is some other news and stuff that I heard recently in the last 24, 48 hours of a guy thinking about moving down to middleweight, then maybe Jared Cannonier would be a good guy to welcome Yuri Prochazka to the middleweight division.
Yeah, I hope Yuri goes down to middleweight. Well, then light heavyweight would be worse. But then again, there's fun fights for him at middleweight.
We sacrifice light heavyweight because I think Alex Pereira might run this division for a while.
Yeah, I think he will until he gets a grappler, but that's a whole nother.
We can do a whole hour episode on that.
But yeah, like if you put Prochazka in here, now you're Prochazka, Cannonier, Strickland, Paulo, Whitaker. Like there's a lot. Yuri versus DDP is an insane fight. Yuri versus Izzy, insane fight. There's just a lot of really ridiculous fights that you could give Yuri if he moves down.
Yeah. You said you like that thought of him moving down?
Yeah, I don't see why not if he can make the weight. He said he didn't cut to make 205. I mean, shit, if you're not cutting to make 205,
You should
cut
make
to 20.
Yeah.
I guess it also depends if he gets the title fight at 205. Like, if you got a title fight, if they're offering him the Pereira rematch, which I'm not sure if they will or not, but if they're offering him the Pereira rematch, then it gets a little pointless. But if they're offering it to Magomed, then it's like, all right, I'll just go down to 185 and try and get a second belt. Like, might as well, in my opinion.
Yeah. That's a fight that I know they're kind of booking most of that UFC Saudi Arabia one, which headlined by Whitaker and Hamzat, but that'd be a great one to be on the co-main, a Yuri Prochazka middleweight co-main event.
Yeah, count me in. Count me in.
Because then you can partner the winners of those up or somewhere or another and make a brawl happen.
I'd love to see how his power would look at 185. Because at 205, he's got a hell of a chin and ridiculous power. If we drop down 20 pounds, does the chin stay and does the power get even more crazy? Because he's kind of winning off attributes and I mean, shit. The attributes could get even more insane if he moves down. So I think it'd be interesting.
Would be fun.
All right. UFC 302, do you have any more comments on the main or co-main before we switch it over to 303 for Conor?
No, not really. Like I said earlier, a little more excited about that co-main than the main event, but it'll be fun. I'll be watching either way, and some interesting other fights on that card, considering it's in Newark, New Jersey. So.
Yeah, like it's not the best pay-per-view, but we're getting 2 pay-per-views that month as well. We got one on June 1st, and then the one we're about to talk about is June 29th. So you're squeezing 2 pay-per-views in the span of a month. Maybe they're not 2 elite pay-per-views, but you get 2 in a month's time span. So that kind of eases the pain a little bit.
And the thing is also the name of pay-per-view has been changed forever after 300. It's like anything we see, we're like, well, it's decent. It's nothing crazy anymore, but at least there's some solid bouts here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Then looking at 303, the big news is obviously Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler, signed on the dotted line. I know I've seen some people say, I don't believe it until they're in the cage. Okay. If it's signed on the dotted line and the UFC's on board for hosting this on International Fight Week, a lot of logistical things go into the UFC booking a fight, which is why this has been not booked for so long. They needed to be very confident that Conor was going to step foot in the octagon. Because if Conor pulls out, then you're left with Chandler versus
Mateus Gamrot.
Exactly. I was gonna say. We just talked about this division is not great.
Michael Chandler, Max Holloway.
We can talk about that after this fight happens, but I think there's a real chance the winner of this fight's for the BMF.
Oh yeah, no, I'm saying like had something happened, Conor pulled out of this fight, and now I think that's the one to make Max and potentially.
Yeah, that'd be it.
But he's not going to pull out. I was very skeptical of this fight ever happening. I was one of the ones that not until it's signed and I see an official statement saying this fight is happening. Here we are. Like, Notorious is returning. Michael Chandler's returning because he's been fun to watch since he came into the UFC. Pure chaos. So it should be a brawl.
Yeah, I always kind of I don't know if I was being delusional, being like, oh yeah, Conor will fight again, but I was always kind of confident that he was going to fight again. There was some time around after the new year. So in the last couple of months, there were some times where I was like, all right, can we get the fight booked? If it's supposed to happen on June 29th, we all know it's supposed to happen on June 29th. Why isn't the fight being booked? But then all of a sudden, everyone's so gung-ho about Islam fighting on June 1st. And I thought to myself, well, if everyone is demanding Islam fights on June 1st, who's fighting on June 29th? International Fight Week. Because if they could have easily just pushed Islam back a month, well, they were struggling to get an opponent for him, but they weren't. So to me, that kind of tipped that, we're getting a big fight for International Fight Week. And it ended up being Conor and Chandler. I'm glad this fight's happening. Like, I think this is the perfect return fight for Conor, because even if people are lower on Conor than they were a year ago or 2 years ago or whenever, say this is the lowest point since he knocked out, Jose Aldo, the lowest point since he became a massive, massive superstar is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, hey, he's fighting the most exciting guy in the division. Do you want to watch? Like, it's a pretty easy sell. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like he's fighting like a boring fight. It's like, we found the most exciting guy possible for Conor's return. Are you interested? Like, it's an easy sell for me.
Yeah, it's just a guy who's going to stand right across him in the cage, and they're going to go at it with one another.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be easy. And I mean, you could have, and like you said, sure, his stock might be at a low since he became a superstar. But you could throw Conor McGregor in against a tin can, and people would tune in to watch. So
people watched Roadhouse.
Yeah,
that tells you all you need to know.
Oh, that movie wasn't awful. It wasn't great. It wasn't a good movie by any means, but it was a lot better than I kind of expected a Conor McGregor movie to be.
I thought it was hilarious. Just the counter scenes of that movie are hilarious.
Because you could tell he'd never acted before. You could tell he's just out there doing what we have seen Conor McGregor do in real life. He was just playing himself in a movie, and it was very entertaining.
I knew we were in for a good time when the very first scene he's walking through a street ass naked.
Yep.
It's like, all right, I know what I'm getting myself into. This is just going to be funny. And if you look at it as something that's funny and has got Conor and you like Conor, the
storyline wasn't terrible, and Jake Gyllenhaal is a pretty solid actor, so it was what it was. But Conor McGregor is just so funny in that movie.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in terms of this fight as well, another thing that I really want to make clear is that I think this is also a great measuring stick of where Conor sits. Because if you can't beat Michael Chandler, and I'm not trying to disrespect Chandler, but we saw Gaethje beat him, we saw Poirier beat him, right? We saw Charles beat him, yeah, right. So if you can't go out there and beat Chandler, what are we doing here? And maybe the answer is I'm just gonna fight guys in the maybe I fight Dan Hooker next if you can't beat Chandler. But maybe you go, well, I can't beat Chandler, then this is pointless now because I was always the double champ. I was always one fight away from a title. It's just I think this is a very, very important fight for Conor. And I think it's going to be very telling from where he sits from a skills perspective as well and a will to win, because maybe he goes out there and makes this clean, but there's a chance Chandler makes this a dirty fight. And when I say dirty, I mean we both have a broken nose. I've picked you up, slammed you on your head. It's round 2. Do you still want to fight?
We're both leaving in the ambulance at the end of this fight.
Yeah.
You can see that happening.
Yeah. Do you still have that dog in you? So I think it's a good test from a skill perspective and from a do you still have that dog in your perspective, both of which I would like to know the answer for Conor.
I'm going to just throw this out here. Say Conor does come out and he looks great and finishes Michael Chandler. Islam does what he has. Is there a chance you think that Conor jumps Arman and fights Islam for the belt later this year?
Yeah.
Because I agree. I think Madison Square Garden in November, if you can have a John Jones, Stipe, and Conor Islam, going to shatter everything.
Yeah, it's because, well, I don't think that'll happen because I don't think you could get Conor or John to agree to be a co-main event.
Yeah, that's fair.
Like, whichever one it is, I don't think either of them agree.
Tag team, John and Conor versus Stipe and Islam.
I always think the Islam and Conor fight, and we can talk about deserved. Will Conor win? Like, maybe he doesn't deserve it, and maybe he's got no shot in hell. Like, both of those things can be true. But I think there will always be an interest of Conor versus Khabib too, and that has kind of fizzled into Conor versus Khabib's protege and a person he's very, very close with in Islam. So I think that is like something that you can really sell from a storyline perspective. And if he goes out there and knocks out Michael Chandler in the first round and the world goes crazy and everyone thinks, oh my God, Conor McGregor's back, I think it's a very real possibility. I wouldn't say it's, 80%, going to happen, But I think there is a chance that it happens.
Oh, I'm with you completely. I think it's tough luck for Armin, but that's why I don't know who it was said it recently. He was like, "Yo, I think it might have been Holloway. You have to take your title shots when you get the opportunity." People were saying this is such, and we know it's such a quick moving sport that all it takes is one Conor McGregor masterpiece, and Armin Sarukian's looking at no title shot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will add this as well. I think that Max versus Conor is, if Max wins, I really think they want Conor to have the BMF. And Max versus Conor, that's a rematch. They sold the Dustin Poirier rematch, not even the trilogy, but the actual rematch the first time they fought, and they sold that history very well. I think the history is a little bit different because Max and Conor didn't really talk trash to each other the first time. That was fairly friendly. Dustin and Conor the first time talked trash, and there was a knockout. The Max and Conor fight was,
That was a decision, wasn't it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Conor tore his ACL in that fight, and just Max Holloway didn't know how to grapple yet. He was like 21, and Conor would land a takedown, and the Max would go, "I don't know how to get up off my back." It was, I think that kind of hampers it a little bit, but Max Holloway, self-proclaimed best boxer in the UFC, holds the BMF belt. Stock is sky high for Max Holloway. I just think that the UFC wants Conor to have that BMF, and I think that's an entertaining fight, Conor and Max, however you want to shape it, and you throw the BMF belt in there, and if he goes out there and beats Max Holloway, then it's like now you have earned a title fight through merit. Like, not even we're rushing you to a title because you're Conor. If you go out there and beat Chandler and Max, you've earned it. Congratulations.
Absolutely.
And you lose to Islam, you get submitted by Islam. Oh, he can't grapple. He can go defend the BMF belt. Like, I think the BMF belt just kind of pushes his longevity and helps his stardom. So I think that's a very real possibility as well.
Yeah, and I mean, he could take that up to 170 if he so wishes down the road, and just fight guys who we know Conor won't fight a grappler at times because it's not his game. So yeah, throw him some guys to stand up wars. Would never happen, but an Ian Gary, Conor McGregor fight would be crazy in Ireland.
I wouldn't be surprised if they do. If we're talking 170 fights, I think Usman would make a level of sense. I know that the grappling is not for Conor at this point in his career. And there was a point in his career where Conor had some actual legit defensive grappling.
He showed some grappling against Khabib in that fight.
Yeah, it just wasn't at Khabib's level.
Yeah.
It was good, but it wasn't at Khabib's level.
Yeah.
But I think that kind of stems from, there was a point in time where Usman was a champion and Conor was angling for that fight. I wouldn't be surprised if they found a way to do that at 170, but that's a whole nother can of worms. And I think you could make an argument Usman deserves to be a BMF. I know not every one of his fights is, much watch television. He's had some stinkers, but he fought Khamzat Chimaev on 8 days' notice. That's a pretty BMF move. He knocked out Jorge Masvidal when people were calling him boring. He knocked out Masvidal. That was the first fight in an arena after COVID. Well, COVID was still going on, but it was the first fight since they were first fight that a pay-per-view wasn't in the Apex. So I think you could really angle that. I think that would really get some people going.
Yeah. Do you want to ask you on the Conor Chandler fight quickly?
Yeah.
Two things. One, betting odds are split even. I'm seeing -110 both ways. Are you surprised that it's that way at the moment, or you think someone should be the favorite?
No, I like the pick 'em because I talked about this a couple weeks ago for 300. When there's a lot of questions, push the line closer to even. And I was talking about Sterling and Cater for that fight, and Sterling ended up winning because the questions were answered in his favor. Now we've got, I have a lot of questions in this fight that I don't know the answer to. How does Conor look after the leg break? How does Michael Chandler look at his age? He hasn't fought in a decent amount of time. Michael Chandler, I don't think his style is going to age gracefully with age. You know what I mean? Once that explosiveness starts to slip, his style is really going to get hit. And we haven't seen him fight. How much is he aged? What does that look like? Maybe he's A-okay, but we don't know that. What happens if it becomes a war? Does Conor still want to fight? This is at 170. We haven't seen Chandler at 170. Is he going to be the same athletic tank? Is he going to be a little bit thicker and not as explosive? How do each guy's chin look at 170? There's just so many questions. Plop it down and pick them and call it a day. That's kind of my thought process on it.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you there. There's just too many questions about it to really lean one way or another. And I'm fine with the pick as well. And only other thing I had to ask you on this one was there was talks of a 165 division. Did you like that? Did you hate that idea? Because I've seen very mixed feelings coming into this week.
Yeah, the 165 division is interesting because I think you can make a compelling division. Move up, so you'd have 55ers who move up, and 170 would become 175. You wouldn't have 165 and 170 and then go all the way up to 85. It'd be 55, 65, 75, 85. So you would have 170 pounders who drop an extra 5, and others that are big that would just sit at stay at 175. But I think it creates a very compelling division of guys that are very big for 155, and guys that are small for 170. Gilbert Burns, Colby Covington are guys that would probably drop.
Oliveira's going to go up, I would imagine.
Yeah, he's missed weight a couple times, but he's not that big. But he's missed weight. Sarukian's very big. Islam's very big. I think it could be very fun, but I wonder if it's my biggest question with 165 is it good in the long term, or is it just fun in the short term that we get a bunch of like fights that we never imagined we'd see? Like the first round of matchmaking at 165, once guys declare I'm a 165er, guys like RDA, probably RDA would be a shoo-in for that division. I think we'd have a very fun round or 2 rounds of matchmaking, but I'd be very interested to see how the landscape of 55, 65, and 70 look after 2 years, and you really can't undo it once you do it.
So
that's my thought process.
So. Yeah, I'm with you. I think it would be fun for the short term, but I think the only reason they would have done it is to make the Conor and Chandler fight a title fight, give Conor a potential shot at a belt. So no, I think it's one of those things.
Yeah, and if he wins, he'd be a triple champ. Yeah. But I think it's interesting though, because the 155 to 170 gap is pretty big. There's a lot of tweeners in between 55 and 70 that just could really use a 165. Kevin Lee, an example. RDA, an example. So there's a lot of guys that would have really used the 165-pound division. Diaz brothers, or Nate more specifically, bounced between 55 and 70. So I could see it, but I just don't really know that it's good in the long term.
Agreed.
All right. Anything else on this Conor and Chandler fight before we move on to the other fight that was announced on this card?
No, I think we'll see what happens. We'll see where we are closer to the time, but on paper, I'm excited for this one a lot.
Yeah, I'm excited too, and I just think it's good to have this finally done and signed and gonna happen. And not to say that we can move on, but we've been waiting for it for so long. It'd be nice to see it happen.
Yeah.
And the co-main event, well, it wasn't announced as a co-main, but Jamahal Hill will fight Khalil Rountree at UFC 303. I assume it's a pretty good runner for the co-main. I wouldn't be shocked if they add one big fight to kind of spruce up the card a little bit, but I think this is a very, very good fight. What do you make of this? Because this took me by surprise, I'll tell you that.
I'll say it took me by surprise, and I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little scared for Jamahal Hill here. We just saw him get absolutely rocked in the first round by Alex Pereira, and the guy he's fighting, Khalil Rountree, has nasty power as well, and he can find ways to finish you on the feet. He's won 4 of his last 5 out by knockout. He had that body kick. Once he gets you on the ground, he's just ruthless. And we saw it with Volkanovski where he got knocked, then comes back and gets knocked again. Maybe it's something that's going to happen with Jamahal Hill because he's not on the old side, but he's 32 now. So one of those things that he's slowly getting up there a bit.
Yeah. Um.
I guess Khalil is 434 though, so
Yeah. It's. I'm not really worried about the age, but you just got knocked out, and he wasn't. It wasn't like he was out like Justin Gaethje. It wasn't like it was uberly violent, but he ate a left hook and dropped clean and 8 shots on the ground. It was a knockout. Obviously, I don't know how else to phrase that, but he occurred damage in that scenario, and I just think it's a little bit too early of a turnaround, especially when you're fighting a guy in Khalil Rountree who. One thing I've always said about Khalil Rountree is if you lose to Khalil Rountree, chances are it's violent. Like
yeah.
I'm sure Khalil can go out there and win decisions, but like look at what he did to Anthony Smith. Like that's a violent stoppage. Modestus Bukauskas, he went out there and landed that oblique kick and put Bukauskas' knee just like he exploded his knee basically. Like you said, the body kick on the ground, violent finish. So I think it's just very, very tough to go from knockout to violent finisher on a very quick turnaround. And it also feels kind of weird because this was booked. Oh, was it even a week after he lost the fight? I mean, it might have been a little bit
It was
more, but
really quick.
we recorded last week on Tuesday, and it was shortly after we recorded. We didn't know about it last week, but
was probably maybe 5 days tops
yeah.
after he fought. So that's what caught me off guard is he's fighting now end of June. That's 2 months away.
Mm-hmm.
That's a quick turnaround.
Yeah. And it's tough for me with Jamahal because I feel like he could use a couple months to, I don't want to say distance himself from the Achilles, but I just think some training would be good. And I don't know if there was ring rust in the octagon because he was out, but it just feels tough. That said, I think he can win this fight. I'm not trying to make it sound like he's walking into his funeral. I picked him to beat Poirier. I think he can win this fight. He's going to have a decent height advantage. He's obviously still got power in his hands. He didn't land anything powerful in the Poirier fight, but it was a relatively short fight. So it's just kind of a weird fight. I do think it will be entertaining. On paper, it's fun to think about. So there's a lot here that makes it interesting. But the quick turnaround is just kind of it's just something doesn't feel normal about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100% with you. It just seems like it's being rushed a bit. And we spoke not even that long ago in today's episode, a little earlier, about how we thought Arman Sarukian going and taking the Islam fight would be a little quick. Arman won that fight, and he didn't take much damage, and he was worried about it. Now you got a guy in Jamahal who got knocked out, taking a fight a little late, little more time in between than that for 302 than it would have been to 302. So I'm concerned, but he was fighting for the belt for a reason. He was a former champion for a reason. So this will be a very exciting fight. And I think it's one that if Khalil Rountree comes out and wins, you can very well make an argument for him to fight for the belt next. And that would be a violent fight.
Yeah, if Khalil Rountree wins, title shot. Like I don't even think there's assuming it's not like, oh, he won a close robbery or not even a close, but like he won via robbery. If he wins this fight cleanly at all, title fight. You just beat a former champion, and now we're getting Khalil Rountree versus Alex Pereira, which is a sensational fight. Count me in. It doesn't take much.
Oh, absolutely.
All right. UFC, there's been some other fights announced for that 303 card. I don't think we have to talk about them because they're all kind of.
We have Joe Pyfer coming back is the only one I want to just say.
Yeah, go ahead if you got something on that.
I mean, it's more like we're expecting him to be this superstar, and he kind of looked really, really good in his first 5 UFC fights. And he came up against Jack Hermanson, who has historically been a very good fighter, but nothing super special, and got whooped. So I'm curious to see how he bounces back, and maybe if it was one that they rushed him a little too quickly, and now they're paying for it.
Yeah, and this fight with Marc-Andre Barrial is interesting because, to me, why are we putting Joe Pyfer on the Conor McGregor card? I assume it's because we're not out on Joe Pyfer, and we'd like to see him make a statement on a Conor McGregor card. That's my assumption of what the UFC is thinking. But Marc-Andre Barrios seems like a kind of a tough fight for that. Like, he's durable, he's tough, he's going to get it to the clinch, he's going to try and wear on Joe. And I think a 3-round fight favors Joe immensely. I mean, if the Hermansson fight was a 3-round fight, he wins. He won the first 2 rounds. And that was Hermansson pulling away with damage via jab, low kick, and having better cardio. So I'm just interested in why Marc-Andre Barrios was the name when maybe you could have found a guy with a little bit worse chin, and then we can get Joe knocking him out on a Conor McGregor card, and we can kind of build that hype back up. So the name was interesting, but from a skills perspective, if he goes out there and beats Barrios, I'm very impressed, and that will be the best win on his resume by a decent margin. We've seen guys like Chris Curtis went out there and had a close fight with Barrios, and I thought Chris Curtis just beat Brendan Allen, and 2 very different stylistical matchups. But it's just an interesting fight for that to be the comeback fight.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one, and I mean, it'll be a fun fight. I just wanted to throw some light on that one.
Yep, I agree. I think that will be a fun fight and one I will be looking forward to. We've talked a little bit about UFC 304 taking place in England, but today we have some official news, and that is the UFC announcing that UFC 304 will take place in Manchester, and it will be for UFC 304. I forgot the date, but that will be
July 27th.
July 27th. Thank you. And then August, where they're going to Australia. So you are a representative of England on the show. What do you make of the UFC making a trip back over to England and it being in Manchester?
I like anytime the UFC goes to England, I think the crowd's always up for it. It's always a great atmosphere, and bringing back their first pay-per-view event since, I want to say, 2016? I think it was 100 pay-per-views ago from what I saw. UFC 204, Michael Bisping beat Dan Henderson. Now you got 2 English champions fighting on it, most likely. I'm assuming Leon Edwards is going to fight Bilal Muhammad. Seems like the fight you have to make at 170. I don't know how I feel about Tom Aspinall fighting. We've said on the show multiple times that it's, kind of want him just to sit out, wait for John Jones, wait for Stipe, whatever that comes, to fight for the real belt. He's from Manchester. They're opening up a new arena, the Co-op Live Arena. This is where they're fighting. He's going to be fighting in Manchester. There's no doubt about it. I'm curious to see if there's a way he can just not put the belt on the line. But I feel like you have to put the interim belt on the line if you're fighting either way.
Yeah, Tom Aspinall is putting a lot of risk on the line to go out there and fight when he could say, no, thank you. I'll wait for – I want to see what happens between John and Stipe and who retires and who doesn't. That'd be a very, very reasonable thing to do, and I think that's what he should do. But then again, the UFC's in his hometown in a new arena. Yeah. So, how do you turn that down? I understand why he's taking a fight. One thing I would like to see is if Tom wins this fight, and we'll say he's defending the interim belt. He wins this fight. We'll just assume for the point I'm making. And then he either gets elevated to champion or beats John or Stipe. So we'll just say he wins this fight and then he becomes a champ. I think this should retroactively count as a title defense.
Agreed.
If he gets the undisputed belts in the same swing of things,
Yeah.
Because in my opinion, title defenses are the most important thing for a champion. And he's going out there and getting a title defense without being the champion and having it being claimed a title defense. It's just very awkward to me.
Yeah. The whole situation surrounding it is weird. And it's one of those things that I'm curious to see who he will fight. I would assume Cyril Gahn is the name, but I don't know. Maybe we see an Alex Pereira move up. I don't think that's the one that should happen. I think Pereira should stay at 205. Spoken about that before, so don't need to get into that. But it is. He is taking a huge risk because right now he's in perfect line to go and fight for the belt next time. If he loses at UFC 304, saying that he is fighting there, it's not official, but we're assuming he will. And he even said he was going to. Then you've lost everything. You have no belt. You're not next in line to fight for the title. In my opinion, I think Stipe and John both retire after that fight. So it's you just sit on the sidelines, you get promoted to UFC champion, then you start really defending it against everybody else. Now we'll see, okay, if he does come out, wins defending the interim belt, I'm with you. If he wins and then gets promoted to UFC champion, he doesn't fight John or anything. I think that should count as a title defense.
Mm-hmm. Can I add? I just kind of thought of this while you were talking. Do you think that another win would maybe entice John to stay and fight Tom? Because I think John is someone who's very, very. He wants to fight fighters with a legacy. And do you think going out there, maybe he goes out there and beats, we'll say Ciryl Gane for argument's sake, but I think Curtis Blades is a very real possibility as well. But we'll say Curtis Blades, say he goes out there and dominates Curtis Blades. Say he goes out there and dominates Ciryl Gane just like John did. Does John look at that and go, I need to beat this guy now because he just did what I did? You know, he beat the same guy I beat. And in my opinion, if John can beat Tom, that's one of the best wins on his resume. Obviously not the best. He's got the DC wins. But I just think it would be so beneficial to beat a guy who may just rule this division for a long time when John's gone. Yeah, so if John can get the jump, I think it's massive for his legacy.
Oh, absolutely. I think if Tom comes out and runs through Ciryl Gane or Curtis Blades or whoever the hell he's fighting, I think that could entice John to come back. Because you sure as hell know that if Tom Aspinall wins in Manchester, he's getting that crowd erupting and calling out Stipe and John.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing they can do to hide from it. It's kind of what's going to happen. So I think if he goes out, then I think if John, and sadly I do think John will make easy work of Stipe. I think Stipe's 4-year layoff is going to be a little too much. It's one of those things, but I think that would be a very spicy fight, and it's one that, like you said, if John beats Tom, we look at that win 5 years down the line when Tom Aspinall has defended the belt multiple times. That win looks better and better each time, and it's more becomes a statement to John's legacy as, he moved up to heavyweight, took him 2.5 years, moved up, beat a guy dominantly, then beat Stipe, the GOAT of the heavyweight division, then beat this guy who's been running the heavyweight division. Conversation's over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think John Jones is the GOAT right now, but I think you can, stat pad it and make it harder for the next person.
Yeah. Just keep running up.
Yeah, and I would compare that fight to Floyd and Canelo over in boxing because I don't think we've seen it in MMA. I don't think there's a comparable fight. But Floyd and Canelo in boxing, Floyd wins that fight, and then Canelo goes on to be a legend in the sport. Then you'll look back at Floyd's resume and go, wow, he beat Canelo. That was a young Canelo, and that wasn't the best version of Canelo. But when you look at the resume and see Canelo, it speaks for itself. And I think there's a lot more I think his heavyweight run would be a lot more the run at heavyweight will be more legitimate with more wins, obviously. But when the first win is Ciryl Gane, who, hey, kind of an easy matchup for John because Ciryl can't grapple.
Yeah.
And then, hey, Stipe, one of the best heavyweights of all time in his prime.
He's
past 40, hasn't fought in forever, and coming off a knockout loss. Tom Aspinall, in his prime, looks sensational. There's no well-rounded as well. There's nothing you can say to John if he beats Tom. And you're not going to be able to make a claim of someone being a better fighter they'd have to put one hell of a resume out there.
Something unheard of.
Yeah, and maybe someone does, but make them do that, right? It's I think it's worth the risk for John.
Oh, I
So,
agree. I mean, at the end of the day, if he was to come out and fight Tom and lose, he's still John Jones. He's still the best fighter in the world and best fighter the UFC's probably ever seen. Personally, I think Tom would beat John if they were to fight, just because I think it's that younger blood that he's got a little more power on the feet, and I think that's where John could get caught. Because if it goes to the ground, it's going to be a very even match at this point in both their careers, in my opinion.
yeah, I'd pick Tom as well. But I've been wrong, and I could be wrong again. So
I wonder what those betting odds would be, because something tells me John Jones would not be an underdog against anybody.
he opened as an underdog against Surreal.
Yeah, I guess that was the question of what's he going to do at heavyweight.
Yeah, did not stay an underdog for long though.
No, and that's what I mean. It's even if he was to open an underdog against Tom, I think fans would very quickly, you don't bet against John Jones kind of thing.
There have been people who have used that as the number one rule in MMA betting, and they've made a lot of money. Do not bet against John Jones. Rule number one.
And the three are: don't bet against John Jones, don't bet against Brazilians, and don't bet against Russians. They just find ways more often than not to get stuff done.
Yeah, it's probably pretty profitable in the long term.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to add on 304 before we get out of here?
I mean, we talked about Cyril Gahn, talked about Curtis Blades. Is there anyone else you think Tom might fight? Do you like the shot of an Alex Pereira? I think it should be one of those two.
No, I think the offers go Cyril Gahn, then Curtis Blades. I'd probably give it to Curtis Blades if I was the UFC and I was handing out offers. I'd call Curtis first.
Stop giving Cyril Gahn.
Yeah, it's just like, come on. You declined the Tom fight once, and I'm not going to offer it to you again now. So I offer it to Blades first. I think Blades would say yes. I imagine they'll probably offer it to Gahn first, and then we'll see if Gahn says yes or no, and then they'll swing it over to Blades. I don't think it gets to a point where we have to go deeper than Blades unless Blades trips and tears his ACL going to the fridge or going out for a walk or in the training room or something.
Agreed. And then who knows where we go from there. Other one, Leon Edwards, Bilal Muhammad, because we didn't really touch on that at all.
Yes, that's true.
Are you intrigued for that main event? Because we're assuming that's going to be the main event.
I think it's pretty safe to assume. Bilal Muhammad has been pissed at Leon, saying Leon's declining the fight. Hey, dude, Leon isn't the one that decided he wanted to fight Colby. Like, the UFC said, hey, fight Colby. The UFC determined when that date was going to be. They fought. And then Leon says, I'd like to fight at 300. The UFC says, yeah, you can fight at 300. Here's 3 names. None of them were Bilal's name. All those guys said no. Then they said, all right, we'll swing you over to England. Yeah. And now it's going to be the Bilal offer. Bilal's pissed at Leon that the UFC got mad that the UFC didn't offer Leon the fight. Like, this is not Leon's fault the UFC didn't want Bilal on 300.
Bilal's mad that the UFC doesn't want him fighting in the main event of UFC 300, which I still think there would have been absolute outrage had that been named the main event. I think people would have lost their mind. I would have been here for it. Love Leon Edwards fighting. So, but I think the ones we got, it would be a great co-main to 300 potentially, but for that to be the main slot, I understand why they didn't offer it to Bilal. And I think he's just looking for something to have, something to be kind of that, they're treating me with disrespect. I'm going to come out and prove them all wrong kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing that I'll add is that Bilal is going to – this card right now, it was announced that this is going to take place on U.S. time in England. So it's pretty much going to be in the middle of the night. It's going to start at like 11 and get done at like 5 or 6 in the morning.
That benefits Bilal, I think.
What?
I think that would benefit Bilal if he trains in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I didn't think about that. If the other guys are training in England, yeah.
So,
but another thing I'll add is that a lot of people were watching Bilal Muhammad at 6 a.m. in the arena. Oh, that could go bad. That could go very bad, knowing Bilal Muhammad's history of not being very exciting. The fans aren't going to be very happy watching Bilal at 5 a.m., 6 a.m. in the morning. Especially if imagine Tom going out there having everybody on cloud 9.
That shows about to say is like, do you think that's part of why they want Tom Aspinall out there? Is because you know he's going to come in swinging and
Maybe.
trying to finish someone in the first 30 seconds to get this crowd going before we have Leon and Bilal.
That adrenaline dump from Tom finish to Bilal in round 3 is it's going to be one of the most insane things. People are going to be sleeping in the arena, but I'm very interested to see what that looks like.
Yeah, I am also. As of now, I'm leaning towards Leon, but it was hard to tell what happened in their first fight. Got ended pretty early, and I don't know. It's one of those ones that I'm excited for.
This is also one last thing I'll add. These next 2 fights are both rule of 35 fights. 155 and 170. The 35 and older stat has not treated these fighters well. And Dustin Poirier, 35 or 36, and Bilal Muhammad, 35 or 36. So, not saying that is law and that is 100% accurate, but thus far in
moving pretty well.
Yeah, in around a 25 fight sample size, it has been the more likely outcome is that the younger fighter wins. So it's just something that should also be mentioned and will be very big talking points the 2 fight weeks for those fights. So
hear me out though. They say screw Bilal, Nate Diaz, we're running it back.
But Nate did an interview where he was like, Leon Edwards is the best thing for the UFC right now.
He's one of the 3 guys I want to fight in the rest of my career. Conor, Leon, and I can't remember who the third one was. I want to say it was like Jorge Masvidal or something, just in the UFC, because I know they're boxing now. So
that's funny. Shout out Nate. Shout out Jorge, I guess. I hope they make some money at boxing.
That's good. I think that's going to be the ugliest boxing fight we've seen since Nate Robinson stepped in there.
All right, we can, before we get too deep in boxing, we start talking about boxing, I start saying disrespectful things because I don't love boxing. So, before we get too deep into boxing, let's call it a show. Obviously, we didn't talk about UFC Vegas 91, as we mentioned, not a great card.
It's just one thing. Who's your pick for the main event? Might as well give that at least.
Yeah, I already wrote the preview. I've got Nicolau. I think Perez could make it close, but I just think Nicolau is a level above at this point.
I'm with you. I think it'll be Nicolau also, and we'll go from there. So
yeah, and for more detailed thoughts on that, I know we didn't talk about it on the show, but I'll have the preview up on Friday as usual. So if you really want in-depth thoughts on that fight card, vendetta-sportsmedia.com, and we'll have the preview, all 6 main card fights. I'll have them broke down so you can get more in-depth thoughts. If interested, best bets as well. So keep your eye out for that later in the week. But until then, we are out, and we'll be back next week with hopefully some news to discuss, because don't know what next week's episode is going to be quite yet. Hopefully the UFC news cycle does us.
Well, I mean, we have UFC 301 to talk about next week.
That's next week?
Yeah, it's May 4th. It's UFC 301.
Well,
there we go.
My bad. I didn't know. 301 snuck up on me real quick. I didn't know it was coming up that soon.
Oh, no, it was straight up 300 a week off. Fight night 301.
Perfect. UFC 301, Brazil. Previewing it next week. Makes our lives easier. We'll see you then.